Hello, everyone. Welcome to ODI. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive here at ODI, and I'm really delighted to welcome everyone here in London and our audience online to this really important debate on the role of aid. I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation tonight. And with such an incredible panel, I'll introduce them in a second, though I don't think they really need an introduction, but Jamie, Stefan, Ratin, and Hannah. And why conversation on the role of aid? Does aid still matter? Does it matter for poor countries' development? That's some question, and that has really been prompted by Stefan's book. You can see it here. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. Stefan published his book a year ago. The book is called Gambling on Development: Why Some Countries Win and Other Countries Lose. And in his book, Stefan is comparing a few countries, and the argument, and I'm sure you'll tell us a lot more about it. It's really that actually what really matters to a country's development is the leadership. It's the elites, and it's the bargain that they strike. It's really this development bargain that allows a country to develop. The outcome can't quite be guaranteed, but that is really what will propel the development of a country. And so this vision, this development bargain is really premised on this national leadership, the politics, and the policies. But then the natural question is, if it is domestic issues that matter so much, what is the role of aid? What is the role of outsiders? Aid ultimately is sort of something that outsiders bring. And aid is not central to Stefan's argument at all. The core concern is with domestic leadership and politics. And of course, that's not necessarily a welcome message, particularly for so many in this room, online, who have built their careers, who have worked, to deliver foreign aid for decades. But of course, aid is subject to increasing skepticism in so many quarters, and that's really why we wanted to have this conversation. So the conversation, the discussion in the book sparked an inspiration with the editors of one of our journals, Development Policy Review, because they thought, right, if aid works best where development bargain has been struck, what should aid then do, given that it is policies and leadership that matter above anything else? But more importantly, what should the role of aid be where there is no development bargain? So the editors of Development Policy Review, that's Annalisa Prizzon, who is with us in the room, and Steve Wiggins, decided to engage 7 colleagues from the global majority countries to discuss Stefan's sort of premise and really debate it. And I think he created a really thought-provoking conversation. You can read the issue online. I'm sure it's in the notes of the event. But that's really the conversation we're going to have tonight as well, because Ratin and Hannah were 2 of the people that were invited to debate, Stefan's argument. And of course, from that, this lively conversation led us to think that we needed to have this conversation online more widely, online and in person more widely, because we are at a juncture where we really are seeing a profound underlying shift around the role of aid. And so it's important that we have this conversation more openly. I know we're seeing everywhere this shift from grant aid to focusing a lot more on different forms of financing, on sort of mobilizing private sector capital, facilitating trade differently. We're obviously seeing much more agency from countries that traditionally have received aid. And of course, there's a big debate around decolonization and whether aid should be reframed as reparations, particularly for countries that have been colonized in the past. So with all of that, let me introduce the speakers. Stefan Durkon is a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the Economics Department at the University of Oxford, and the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies. But Stefan, of course, also worked as an advisor and the defunct Department for International Development. So some of the things he's reflecting upon is not just from a an academic perspective, but it's also because you've seen firsthand what works and does not work. To my right, Ratin Roy is the managing director here at ODI. Ratin before was the chief executive of the National Institute for Fiscal Studies in New Delhi, and long career in UNDP and in other places all over the world, but also served as an economic advisor to the 13th Finance Commission in Delhi as a joint secretary for the government of India. Next to Ratin, there is Hannah Ryder. Hannah is the founder and CEO of Development Reimagined. That's an independent African-led international development consultancy that has strong expertise on both Africa and China. And another fellow UNDP, former colleague, and also in the Department for International Development, with a lot of sort of experience both in Africa and, of course, the engagement of China. And last but not least, to my left is Jamie Drummond. Jamie describes himself in his bio as a serial advocacy entrepreneur. And I mean, who doesn't know what Jamie has done, from the Jubilee 2000 Drop the Debt campaign to the creation of One.org, Data.org. I mean, it is thanks to Jamie's effort that, $100 billion of debt were, pretty much cancelled. And, it's mobilized an entire generation of people working in the aid sector and continues to push us, to do more and do differently with the resources the richer countries have, to sort of make sure that we can have better cooperation. So I'll have a quick round of questions for my colleagues here, and then I'm really opening up to everyone in the room, but particularly we have 400 people online. There should be an iPad somewhere. You got the iPad, okay, good. So I can look at the questions that come from online. So let's also make sure that we have, we amplify the conversation online. We thought that for the occasion we would revamp an old hashtag that the Humanitarian Policy Group has been using for a long time, ahead of the World Humanitarian Summit and beyond, which was Remake Aid. We still need to remake aid, so let's use the hashtag tonight. Stefan, let me ask you first. So what should the role of aid be in countries with the development bargain and without the development bargain?
Very good. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. And it's great to be amongst friends here. And it's also great. And I'm actually extremely grateful for the journal to do this. It's actually, I wanted to write a book that would stimulate discussion. And I'm very pleased that there is a bit of discussion. I have no agenda in terms of slagging off my last 10 years of career, being critical about it, or anyone else who has different views on this. Let me just quickly get a couple of the points in answer to your questions there. And so I talk a lot in the book about some group that I call elites. What I mean by that is not aristocrats or some kings or whatever, but basically I want to actually say as a shortcut, for in every society, you have groups of people in politics, in business, in the military, often senior civil servants, journalists, and so on, academics as well, that somehow are a little bit more equal than the others, that somehow have more power and influence. And I would say, I worked in Whitehall for an office in the last job I had. They also are in the UK like that. So you have somehow structure. And I like to, as one shortcut to think about societies, of thinking, a society, a state is essentially a form of an elite bargain between these groups. There can be pressure from below, but they have blocking power. They have a real important blocking power. Now, in the book, I make a very simple argument in saying, look, if we look at progress in development, if I make it very starkly dichotomous, as if there's two groups, and I would say, look, if I look at the countries that started making at some point progress in development, is that somehow or another, the elite bargain they had found that growth and development is important for them, that it maybe gives them lots of rents, maybe it gives them legitimacy, maybe whatever it is, but it became important enough for them. And if you look around the world, and that's not just East Asian countries, not just China, you see it in Bangladesh, you saw it in Ghana, in Ethiopia during the period 2005 to 2020, that somehow that is there. And that's the countries I call they have a development bargain. There's other countries that in that kind of dichotomous distribution, which is of course not a reality, but then I looked at Malawi or I looked at the DRC in Nigeria, some democracies, some not democracies, where it's actually not the case. Now, we cannot talk about it, and I do think without that underlying objective of those people in power that actually want to develop, you never see developments, because they have that blocking power. They have another agenda. So now what is on the role of outsiders? Well, of course, I have a framework, and other frameworks are available. And of course, there's outside influence, outside roles. But in my sense is that, aid is fundamentally different if we take these distinct cases. If there's a country where somehow or another they appear to want to make progress in development and in growth. Now, we can have other judgment. We may worry about the human rights, and fine. We may worry about other things. But if they do that, and if you then decide to provide aid, well, they will spend it well on development. They will actually make progress in development. You may see progress in the economy. You may progress in that. So if they have the objectives of wanting to develop, and if you have a pot of money like we used to have in the UK and a little bit left, then we can say, well, we can work with them. These are countries with a development bargain. My point is actually on aid is that it has a real serious role there. It's actually been really useful in Bangladesh. Naomi Hossein has written eloquently about it. In Ghana, it was useful. In Ethiopia for periods. It was really incredibly useful and actually quite effective. In fact, I would actually go further. We should have been so much more willing to let these countries then decide what to do with it. Budget support, all these kind of things. So aid in a country with a development bargain, actually arguably the model that we started devising maybe late 1990s, early 2000s, and then slowly went away with because we noticed one model doesn't fit all. We should have actually continued that in some of these countries where there's a real commitment to development and actually doing it. And you have to be liberal a little bit with interpretation, how strong it is. And no society is perfect, and we should start with our own saying. Now, what do you do in countries without a development bargain? Well, that's really hard then. Now, you can have two things that you could do. Either you could do, a bit of the Bilistali, Ambisa Moyo, you just stay away because you're making it worse. Now, maybe. And I do worry about sometimes that we didn't do that analysis, that we didn't think about that. Are we actually potentially doing worse? When I worked in DFID, we rarely had a case of, say, a health program where we would say, are we doing harm? And then there was one line, no, we won't do ever harm with a health program. I do think that 60 years of health programs in northern Nigeria may have done harm in the sense that we now have a country that still spends the lowest share of their government budget on health in that country. Not saying they did, but you should at least consider that. 60 years of aid in Malawi, and it's still a totally stagnant society, and some progress, yes, but very little. I wonder whether we did harm with all that kind of engagement. So you have to ask that question. That's all I'm saying. The other side of it, then you have to have the humility in saying yes. And, political scientists, governance advisors in the organizations and so on, we all, and I can get excited about it. We can maybe from outside engineer then with aid to get it done. And we do all kinds of clever, smart things. Sometimes these things will work, but we just have to have humility. If I put money in civil society on monitoring of democracy in Ghana or in Kenya, I probably actually can do something quite good. If I do that in Nigeria, I've never heard of a program, maybe I'm wrong, but I've never heard of a program that actually can show that there actually have been some effectiveness of these. We have to just be willing that it's really hard to do that, and maybe sometimes not do it. So what you do then is be much more with humility. You start with that. Understand better how aid comes in to do it. And then if you don't think, well, let's just do good and provide people with support, even then be willing to question it. So for me, I really had a total change of mind on a lot of things when I was in South Sudan, when we went behind enemy lines in rebel-held territory. We landed there with a helicopter. I was struck. I didn't see a single soldier. So after a bit, we found the rebel chief there. And I asked, there was only NGOs around the airport, and there were all no security whatsoever. What do you think of all these NGOs? And the rebel guy said, well, they are our friends. They've been here for 20 years doing emergency aid. And then he added, and they allow me to get on with the business of war. So, let's be willing to be critical and self-critical about what we do in this business, and not just assume that we never do harm, and maybe rethink how we do it. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yep. We actually wrote a paper not long ago. It was an internal paper. It was never published, but it was a paper that was analyzing the inadvertent consequences of humanitarian aid to South Sudan. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, just by looking at the figures on the economy, how big the aid flows were, and what was actually sort of keeping the countries afloat and the government afloat. It stirred up a lot of discussion, particularly in the US, which was the biggest provider of aid, and you can just imagine the level of conversations. But let me move to Ratin. Ratin, do you agree with Stefan?
I think the most agreeable thing about Stefan's book is it moves the discourse away from, if you like, a positivist theory of transformation. Forgive me, I don't like the word development. So, to saying that transformation is a probability. I describe it in my own work as, since I'm from India and we love Bollywood, as an 18-reel movie. And what I've observed across my life is that this movie normally has a bad ending. Some movies, the South Korean movie had a good ending, the West European post-war movie had a good ending, the Chinese movie had a good ending, I think. I think there's one more to come, let's see. And the Indian movie is not looking good, but it's still in progress. And some movies, you're right, are unambiguously bad. And it's quite certain that these movies are not made by the common people of a country. They are made and crafted by elites. And I think that's good. And we don't have to debate the word elite too much, because I certainly think they're made and crafted by elites. The trouble is, I'm not quite sure that what the elites set out to do, and I said this in the response, is a development bargain. The first time India even talked about reducing poverty in any official document was in 1969. That was 22 years after independence. Because India was not interested in poverty reduction or in education or in health, all the things that today's world you think of as development. They were interested in surviving. And surviving meant two things: procuring the material de guerre to make sure that in a Cold War environment, one could be independent of the Soviet Union and America, and feeding people. For which purpose they took aid to feed people. If you look at Vietnam, which I studied, Vietnam's major preoccupation after unification was not development. Again, look at the Communist Party documents to the Third Congress. They don't even talk about development. They talk about staying unified. China doesn't want some horrible sword, coming and, feeding opium to the masses and taking over the country for 100 years. And that was their preoccupation after Mao, because they had a political theory behind it. So actually, if you look at the so-called dev successes, you will find that each of them had a different, if you like, meta objective. And that meta objective was never development. Now, it certainly is true that as part of that bargain and having succeeded in whatever they're trying to do, there was a development imperative that arose. That is the second challenge I'm most familiar with in India. That once you've done all this, you've survived, you've built your universities, you have space capability, you've got an army that wins wars a few times. Now you're saying, oh, well, now people want something, my God, to feed them for the poor. And in fact, it's quite interesting. If you take the Indian example, my father told me, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, because it happened before I was born. We had a war with Pakistan as usual in 1965. And apparently the Americans were feeding us something called PL-480 wheat aid. Came to Bombay Harbor, opened their ships and dumped the wheat in the sea in front of the citizens. And that actually is what led India to go into the Green Revolution and to make two commitments. One, that, and the second was to reduce aid to 1% of GDP in 10 years. And it was great. So, I don't know now, soil degradation and all that, but still. So India feeds its population, and it's a lot of population internally. But again, the response here was a political imperative. It was not that India's agricultural self-sufficiency or feeding its people came as a result of a desire to feed people. People have been dying for a long time in India, so it was okay for a while. Because elites think like that. You see, they don't particularly have one of them take these things very seriously because you don't experience them. So that's my first point, I think. So Stefan's framework is interesting, but to sort of conflate it in a binary way with development or no development, I think may lead us to miss some of this. And you yourself quoted in response to my piece, didn't you? But a Chinese person saying, a Chinese official saying, we didn't do this to reduce poverty. This is something completely different, right?
Yeah. So we wanted just to do it for growth. So they corrected me in a meeting in China, and I was very struck that I'd said, congratulating them on growth and poverty reduction. Said, no, we never wanted poverty reduction.
So here's the left field what I promised you, Stefan. So I think one problem in your book is that you talk about elites in the recipient countries And you talk about the donors as if they had no elites or no society.
Oh, yes.
So the country England, that's not ever so.
Sure.
Particularly if you're English speaking. Elites in English speaking countries deal with elites in the US and elites in the UK. I'm sure the French do that, whatever, But even outside coloniality, the conversations about resource transfers, about economic relations, trade, aid, anything, take place, broadly speaking, within elites, between elites. So which elite is doing the aiding and what their perception is of this development bargain, for it is a bargain then between elites, recipients, and that was a fairly straightforward question in the Cold War. And I continue to believe, by the way, that aid is not altruistic. US gave you aid if you were part of the US camp. Russia gave you aid if you were part of the Russian camp. And if you were Indian and you were clever enough, you got aid from both. Kowalski called it a calf that sucks at two cows. But the conversation was explicitly political. Now, what the best that happened after the Cold War is that everyone started talking about saving Africa and that sort of thing, and aid as altruism and livelihoods and poverty. I don't think it was ever about that. But undoubtedly, development successes came when I think elites in countries that had a coherent and clear reason, I think China is very important here, and it's a big lesson we learned from them, to do business with elites in countries with a bargain, would engage in that bargain in which development was one leg of the bargain. And I'll conclude by telling you how this has ended. I only have to look at this country. With the dissipation of the elites, ability to bargain for a future for Britain with countries outside, you get a bunch of stuff coming out, integrated framework, Indo-Pacific, it's like a bunch of jargon comes out. Because there is no bargain to be had, because the elites are broken here. So not able to, and I think the Labour Party has a big job to do here, to sort of reconstruct a bargain as part of its foreign policy, where it is able to interlocute intelligently with elites in other countries who are completely willing to, sort of do that. But to do that, you need to have an elite that is able to bargain in the developed country that is in this aid relationship in the first place. So I think that is one dimension, perhaps, that would bring more texture to otherwise what I thought was a very enjoyable and very important thing.
Thank you, Radhi. Hannah, what was your take on the book and the proposition that Stefan put?
Well, I very much welcomed Stefan's book, and first of all, thank you also for inviting me to be on this panel and also contribute to the journal. I thought it was very refreshing, especially Stefan's call for humility in the aid sector. I think that's very important. And I also thought that it was, it's a new theory of development practice, basically. And I thought that was important, and I'm really glad that he has got us to be thinking differently. At the same time, I also thought one of the key challenges with not just Stefan's new theory on development, but with many of the other theories and critiques on development, whether it's the Sachs, Dambisa, etc., is that they don't really grapple with this issue that outsiders have been in most of our countries, African countries especially, for centuries. And so aid is just the very recent framing of outsider participation in these countries. And as a result, Stefan is absolutely right that I thought, he made a very strong case for why aid is not, the answer to development, something which my firm firmly kind of really is not the only answer to development, right? There's so much more out there. But also that we need to kind of look beyond that. I think because of not having tackled those issues around the existing kind of imperialism, look, Rathan, you're talking about India, China, etc. What they were doing fundamentally was trying to escape dependency, to build their sovereignty. And it is that led to development, fundamentally. And so one of the questions is, it's not even a development bargain. It's really about how do you enable a development struggle for independence, like real independence, economic independence in the sense of Kwame Nkrumah's economic independence. And that, that is not just about aid. if you're talking about tools in the UK, that's about foreign direct investment. Stefan was talking about DRC. DRC is a country where the UK and others, the US and others, have been investing in extractives. It's not just about the government. In fact, a lot of the time it's really about many other actors who are around the government and hardly involved with development in themselves. So how do you get them to shape their interactions? That's not necessarily a bargain. That's a struggle against UK's fundamental economic interests, for instance, or US's fundamental economic interests, or Chinese fundamental economic interests at this point in time, for instance. So that's where I felt that his theory and others' theories are incomplete, and so we do need to think about the impact of elites, but we need to think about it in a more holistic way, and elites from donor countries, for instance, and the toolbox from donor countries, which is not just aid, is also about all of the other types of engagement, outsider, external engagement.
Thanks, Hannah. Stefan, I'll let you respond to Rathin and Hannah in a second, but I want to bring in Jamie as well. I mean, Jamie, you've heard the original proposition from Stefan, Hannah's and Rathin's reaction. You were not part of the symposium, so this is your chance to say what role you think aid should play, if any at all.
I think there is a role for aid, but I usually have an allergic reaction when somebody says, we know that everything's important, but today we're only going to talk about aid. And then everyone piles in on aid as if somebody then said, anyone thinks that aid is the only answer. And that happens again and again and again. So I'm going to repeat myself. Somebody says, let's have a conversation where we know all these other things are important, but we're only going to talk about aid. And then everyone says, but aid's not the only important thing. And it's a media trap and it's a political trap. So we've got to do all of these things. And so with that very important caveat, I had two very specific questions for Stefan, which may or may not be answered in other parts of this conversation, but I want to know because I want to work for this hypothesis, but I cannot effectively do so without these answers. One is, how do you know when you've got one? How do you measure it and how do you know? Otherwise, it sounds like a useful thing to know many years later and write books about, but, which is very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
But how do you know in the moment whether you've got one? Because otherwise it's not that helpful. And the second is, the elites I know are rarely just national. They're subnational, they're regional, and they're global too. And this is a much more fluid thing. And there are good ones and there are bad ones. And theories of influence and how to make this world a little better and less bad need to be very, very, I think, nuanced and sophisticated about that journey between all of these things. And we might be over-focused on the national level of actors, when in fact, from what little I know about elites, is they like hanging out with each other. And they like doing so in different countries and cultures. And they often spend a lot of time in the south of France, and a few other places. So there's just a lot more sort of, I think, about the beyond just the national level conversation. But I think it would be intellectually and morally dishonest of me not to say a bit more about, tell a slight story, which is, I spent a lot of time working for a version of what I think was this, but not exactly the same, which was the data deal, as we called it at that time. And the idea was, and the data deal was cooked up in a meeting with Nelson Mandela, and partly inspired by and at the request of Desmond Tutu. So this wasn't cooked up on a napkin in Notting Hill. It was definitely a response to inspirational Global South leadership. And it was that, could you people who worked on the anti-apartheid campaign internationally in solidarity with that struggle, please work on the debt issues. Please work on smart aid, especially in the context of the AIDS crisis that was going on at that time. Direct request from both Mandela and Tutu. and please work on fair and just trade terms. And also the citizens of a lot of these countries are saying, we want democracy, we want accountability, we want to hold our leaders accountable, and we want transparency of institutions. And that's where the data deal came from those conversations. And it was an aggregation of those campaigns and those demands from various different places. Happened to also have a handy acronym that focused on data. So we could point to, being hard-headed, when in fact it was a tissuing together of these sort of inspirational campaigns and demands from these leaders. The point was, though, we would internationally gather around those countries where there was democratic, accountable, transparent leadership focused on the development of the citizens and investing in the people. And it was essentially an expression of what was then NDG 7. And this is around the year 2000. So it was sort of a global development solidarity bargain. And I liked it. And I think a lot of people really liked it. And it pulled together a lot of interesting, passionate causes and campaigns that were global and that above all connected citizens around the world. And it wasn't about elites. But implicitly it said these things will only work where a country has a development bargain. And, because, that's when they're transparently and accountably investing in the development of their citizens. And we then concocted various ways by which we thought we could try and measure, which is why I'm asking you that question. There were the criteria around HIPC, enhanced HIPC and MDRI. There were the criteria around the Millennium Challenge Account.
Explaining
and various
it
other
for those
things.
who are not familiar with the acronym around the debt.
Development student
but
here, so I'd be very
people,
disappointed.
400 people following online, they may not all.
The enhanced HIPC, the Enhanced Heavily Indebted Countries Initiative was the mainly bilateral transfer of debt cancellation around 2000, and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative was the entirely multilateral transfer of debt cancellation around 2005. And the Millennium Challenge Account was a Bush-era initiative to get behind countries that were demonstrably and measurably investing in their citizens. And I think it was very helpful in countries like Ghana and Tanzania and Senegal. Yes, there's other acronyms we can read. I'm telling that ancient history because it to some extent it was trying to work on what Stefan pointed out. And according to the measures we had at the time, Mali was a good bet. Madagascar was a good bet. But also more plausibly, perhaps Burkina Faso was a really good bet. And lots of complicated things have happened in these places since then. And some of them had disasters, political disasters, almost immediately after these compacts were signed, which shows the flaws either of the whole theory or of the mechanisms or the means that we had to measure whether or not they had a bargain. So that comes back to that question. How do we know we got one?
I do want to hear the answer to that question, but can I push you a bit further, James? Because I think nobody would argue that what happened in HIPC, that cancellation, trade facilitation, better terms of trade, I think this is still what a lot of countries are after. And beyond the development bargain, and particularly where there is no development bargain, there is a bigger question around the role of aid. And you talked about this global development solidarity bargain, which I think was really true, when you were putting these big, campaigns together. But do you think we've delivered on that global solidarity? I mean, this is something that I am, often uncomfortable about how the past 20 years of delivery of aid have actually turned out to be.
So this is an important question. I can give you a quick answer, but it's the subject, I hope, of many PhDs and everyone's evolving practice. No is the answer. But we weren't doing too badly between about 2005 and 2007. But there was a thing called the financial crisis. And then there was a response of quantitative easing. Then there was a huge commodity super cycle. And you had the small amounts of global solidarity and development completely crushed by the wave of other kinds of finance and incentives. And, that's what happened. And then you had brilliant isomorphic mimicry happening left, right, and center, which made many of us think that there were some development bargains going on when there were not. I think you throw that into the mix.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
there is another part of the answer that is going to be for a follow-up event on what I think what has really become the development industry has ended up being around this that we will debate in a separate conversation. But Stefan, how do you know when there is a development bank?
So, okay, so I want to also react in the process to some of the other points made. So, actually, I want to first actually respond to this point of, what countries are setting out to do. Donald Kaberuka, the former president of the African Development Bank, I think finance minister from Rwanda, these days peddles a very provocative line for African countries. And he says, growth and development is actually just a choice. And he keeps on saying that is a choice. It's a choice that countries make. And I was actually very struck by that because I hadn't talked to him at all about it. And talking further about it, implicitly, he was alluding to this. And it's actually in a little bit that more subtle way that you were trying to describe on the, it's not that every country has a development plan and every country says they're going to do all this stuff. But actually, there are countries where in their actions and behaviors, it appears to be consistent with that progress. National objectives always play a role. And, it took a long time in India before actually you would start seeing inactions and actually that more systematically political leadership wants to be judged by, say, progress in growth or in development after the 1990s, but definitely it's very striking now. It becomes part of it somehow that virtually every political force in India feels like they want to be judged by this more and more. So there's clearly something that shifted. So they may have still other objectives, what they have, but I'm talking a lot about consistent with this. Everybody says they're going to do it, but actually are they acting and behaving consistent with this? Because in the end, I'm still quite cynical about most of these elites. They want to cap their rents, they want to stay in power, they want the Communist Party to continue to exist in China. And that was obviously the main purpose. Can we keep in power and not be dependent on anyone else? So there is something there that, and I don't want to say suddenly, as they all start saying, I want growth and development. So no misunderstanding there. But then a lot was said about what the outsiders, the role of the outsiders here, and what are their thing. And I was very glad that you said in the beginning, Sarah, that this was not meant to be a book on aid. And it's the funny thing is that once I got and I kept on thinking, okay, how do I bring this all together towards the end? But I can't deny that for 10 years I sat in the middle of that world. It's something I've seen and I've observed. And I wanted to say something on it, recognizing entirely that, and I put it somewhere, let me make the very brave assumption that the objective function of those involved in providing, I'm not trying to go and explain this. And in fact, there's a few lines here and there. But because I also thought what I wanted to go against is, and don't underestimate how strong that is in the aid community, this idea of one model fits all. When you go to the World Bank, every country has the same ways dealt with. Whether you're actually trying to achieve something as a country or not. It's a cooperative bank, you get a quota. Yeah, it's a little bit of adjustment if you behave according to some of their indicators, which are not the ones that I'm after, Jamie, the CPIA or whatever. But a small adjustment. So it's a one model fits all. In fact, they strongly defend it. We are a cooperative bank, they like to say. If you look at DFID or FCDO, you have one framework almost, and you say, we're going to go to fragile states. But if it's a fragile state where they're really trying to achieve something, or a fragile state where they, for God's sake, definitely don't want to achieve something as a leadership, you don't care. You're still going to you provide money based on needs. You don't provide money in terms of potential impact. So there is something there that you want to break. But I want to come back on the outsiders, and I will totally accept that's a weakness. And it comes a little bit to do with, I remember writing the book during COVID, and so gradually seeing the world crumbling around you and the geopolitics coming up. I say, oh my God, how are you going to deal with this? And I do think, and the more I reflect on it, the period that I kind of use also data for, like 1990, 1995, maybe to 2015, was a remarkable period where actually that objective function didn't have to be as narrowly the national interest, because the Cold War was not there. Fukuyama's end of history, that was not quite the end of history, but a temporary hold to it. And so you sit there, where now the world looks so different. And, I can assure you, having sat in FCDO, it's, the objective function is different. Let's put it like this. I also spent in the last few months about a month and a half in Senegal and Niger. And I must say, sitting in a Sahelian country, a Francophone former colony, it feels even an extra layer. The dependency of Senegal, Senegal, a democracy, stable country that still has the same amount of extreme poor people now than they had in 1990 as a number. You say it must be something wrong given your location. And Dakar is a wonderful, vibrant place that is remarkably French in everything. And so I mean the lock-in, and that Niger with the uranium lock-in with the French and so on. So it's there. And if I had spent this time there, I would have written it differently. I'll come down to the final thing. I was trying to avoid that. How do we know we are in one? So there is a tricky thing, because if you, as I want to do, a lot has to do, as you said in the introduction, it is to do with the agency of the movers and shakers in the elite. It is about agency. It's about actions and behaviors. It's about people, like Donald Kaberuka says, that have a choice. A choice cannot be predicted based on 1960 data. I think in a lot of countries, choices are made. If you look at history of almost any country, and I'm thinking, and I work a lot on Ethiopia, in 2018, choices were made. In the beginning of the conflict in November 2020, choices were made. There were also choices made suddenly in South Africa, where they said, oh, what the hell, let's go back to the old elite bargain. And they make a deal for peace in Ethiopia. These are choices, all these moments could have gone differently. There were moments that looked different. And that's actually crucially important. So it's not easily predictable, but you want to look at actions and behaviors. And that makes it always that as a result, you'll always be a bit behind. Who said in 1979 that this was going to be the beginning of all the progress in China? I don't think anyone. It was going to be very hard. There was very little evidence that it would actually lead to where they would be going. So yeah, you take a bit of a gamble on these countries. And so that's actually a little bit what I want to allude to, and to actually saying, look, if you want to, as outsider, do something good, or as an NGO, take a bit of a gamble if you have some signs. I know at the moment it's not there in Malawi. I don't think I see anything. But if you see governments taking quite courageous choices on certain things, and we may not agree exactly what it would be, but if we put a room of 20 people working, Malawians and non-Malawians in a room, and say, what do you think are the 10 things we should need to see? There's probably a few overlapping things. And that's what I mean. So you need to be willing to make a judgment on it. And I'm willing, as you were also alluding to, you can get it wrong, and be willing to do that. But I don't think we do enough.
You have to be in the room. I don't. That's what I don't like. How do you intuit?
Well, you observe actions and behaviors. I mean, I spent time in Madagascar. I can assure you there's nothing that has anything to do with development going on in Madagascar at the moment. There's nothing there. There is one particular person close to the president who controls everything. He's a businessman. And, next time you buy vanilla or a lychee, just worry a little bit about it, what it means for Madagascar. And you know that. There's nothing happening at the moment.
I would contend, though, that sometimes, again, from my lived experience in a number of countries, there are two sides to this. One is very difficult to know, because in reality, there are very few people from the elite north that go into, to work in these countries. They have enough of a contextual understanding. They really understand, who are the movers and shakers, the elite, or the potential bargain that is there, and miss it completely. And we do that over and over and over again, and we still haven't learned to actually really have a much deeper, appreciation of the local sort of analytics and knowledge. We just discounted. Too many donor representatives sit in kind of very removed areas of a capital, and don't really have that knowledge of the context that is needed to appreciate that development bug. And the other part is that it's political. You want certain countries to have a development bargain, even when clearly there isn't one. So you're always going for the one that you think should have it, rather than one that really has it. But we need to open to the audience. So I just wanted to.
I want to just say one sentence additional, and Hannah wants to come back. Just one little one, and just what you said on the knowledge, the local knowledge, and doing that. Okay, so I was, strangely enough, just spending my time before this event briefing the senior management team of the UN on, let me not say a huge amount, but beyond that. In the summing up after the briefing, you get the Secretary General saying, clearly our resident coordinators don't understand enough economics and political economy. And I thought, okay, if that's progress, it's exactly what you say. We have just too many people who sit in these very important places, have actually never invested in actually trying to get a bit of deep knowledge. Now you can be wrong, you can be biased within it, but at least try. And it's exactly that kind of issue that you described.
Well, I think it's not just deep knowledge as well. And I think part of it is also escaping, again, this consistent idea that governments in poorer countries are bad. And I think one of the issues with the development discourse is this constant kind of idea that that governments in developing countries are bad somehow, that they're not doing good things, etc. And that is not a new discourse either. That is an old discourse, also a colonial discourse. And so escaping from that, the Chinese approach, the emerging economies approach is instructive. A gamble, Stefan, in this context, is a gamble by just engaging with lots and lots of governments all the time and consistently, government to government interaction. And that's not what you have in the UK, for instance. It's not what you have in the US, although the US is starting to change that a little bit. France, same, just be with your friends. No, actually gamble, really gamble if you are going to do it. And by gambling, respect your other government as an equal, because you're also going wrong. They're also going wrong. That's just a normal aspect of governance in general. And once you have that, I think then it is possible with an equal partnership, it is possible to identify where you can actually work together. And I think that's a much easier way of doing things.
In fact, if I may just quickly say, you're so right, because the question I get asked by emerging economy governments, since I now live in the UK, they say, oh, you live in London. So tell me something. The Scotland, is it going to sort of secede? Because then what's the point of talking to Whitehall? Nobody even thinks that they're thinking that. When they come to North Block or they come to, China and they give it a cup of tea, that's what is going on in his head. This British coming here. Is Scotland going to secede? Because they're already screwed up on Brexit. Now Scotland will go. Should even bother talking to them. And then I get this repeatedly, but how come they can't feed their kids? How come, their kids are going hungry? Because they know that. They know that kids have to, pay for school meals at 1/3 the per capita income. And then they're coming in talking about, integrated program and whatever, Indo-Pacific, and like, go and feed your kids first. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what I meant by, the view of the elite donor is something that, is including in your analysis, frankly, is blank. It's almost like the donor is an efficient algorithm. Yeah. And the recipient country has society and state and that sort of thing.
I think this is a perfect moment to open to the audience. Let me start with the people in the room. So there's a roving mic somewhere. Raise your hand, say who you are, and yeah. And if your question is directed to anyone in particular. And if I can have the iPad in the meantime for the online question.
Yeah, I'm Tim Kelsall from the Politics and Governance Programme at ODI. I could talk to you a lot about political settlements because there's a strong overlap between that kind of body of knowledge and some of the theses in your book. But instead, I want to ask you a different question. The book is titled Gambling on Development, but it seems to me that from the point of view of developing country elites, some of them actually face pretty long odds when it comes to developing. If you're an elite in Malawi, Malawi doesn't have a huge amount going for it when it comes to engaging on international markets, for instance. So, in fact, with those long odds, is it not rational to have a non-developmental elite bargain? And so the question for me would be, what can the international community do to shorten the odds for developing country elites so that they actually find it rational to gamble on development?
Thank you, Tim. Other questions, please, gentlemen.
Okay. Nick Gates from Public Digital. I'm wondering if there's certain conditions that make the development bargain, as you put it in the book, more likely to withstand national elections. I'm thinking specifically, we were talking about the upcoming elections in Sierra Leone today, thinking about what that means for the development bargain. And then also I recognize that aid is not a monolith, and there can be a development bargain within specific sectors or around specific topics like digital transformation, for example, which we see with India today. And I'm wondering how you think of the development bargain around specific topics, since aid is not a monolith. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Otherwise, we'll go online. So I've got a question from Marisol Valle. She's a doctoral student at Saxe University. Building on what Hannah Ryder is speaking about, problematizing development and aid, what role do reparations have, if at all, in this dialogue? Is it feasible to implement reparations as a form of development without bargain? And another question from Bikram. It says, I know for a fact one of Stefan's cases, Ethiopia's impressive growth in infrastructure was paid by Chinese loans, while the social sector gets extensive support from Western donors. I don't know who made this bargain, how and why though. Could Stefan comment on this?
Good question.
Stefan, do you want to start?
No, very happy. So the point on so I want to first actually acknowledge that, you know, I learned to think about a lot of these things in DFID when they kept on commissioning people like Tim to actually fight on political settlements, and it's just I mean there's a lot of overlap. It's maybe slightly different, but it's not. But there is something there about that link between politics and economics that is definitely there as in common. But I like, you know, the framing of your question is exactly also how I want to think about it. You know, one of the best things we can do as an international community is to not tell a country what gambles they should take, but try to shorten the odds that amongst the different gambles they can take, can we actually do it? And so one of the things that definitely is at a low level these days is actually attempts to do international things that create positive incentives for these countries. You know, we've forgotten. You know, we kind of say, oh well, you know, a lot of tariffs have gone a bit through the window and it's not that much anymore. But learning to export for a country is really hard. And I mean, one of the programs that never came to fruition in DFID that I'm still quite proud of, and we were all debating, was an input subsidy program for Africa, where we would use taxpayers' money to subsidize imports from countries who are trying to export or something. Of course, you can see the slide floor with the Daily Mail for that, but you know, that kind of thing that you're kind of actively trying to do it. I'm also, and it's not particularly for Malawi, and on the Malawi actually, I still think they can do a bit better than they do. You know, by not screwing up the agricultural sector, they could do a couple of percentage points growth higher. But I agree with you, Malawi won't be Singapore doing it. And so think of things that you can do, provide positive incentives for things. Trade is definitely a powerful thing. De-risking investment, if you find ways of doing it. You know, and these are the kind of things that I would still do. So there was a question on can you do it around topics. I want to be careful. I think these can be entry points. Digital is a great entry point because every government loves tech and wants to be on the picture with some tech entrepreneurs. So you have an entry point, but actually there's another reason why digital is an interesting case, because in most of these countries there's no incumbents. And so it's actually a kind of an economic sector. And we saw that in India, that in southern India, that could actually take off despite the license Raj and the kind of, so, you know, that could take off because we weren't threatening the old structures in the economy. And this is also the way I want to think about it. You could say, well, actually use these as entry points to actually see, can we unlock it? But definitely not because there's a nice minister who you can talk to. The biggest mistake we always make, oh, but this minister really wants it, therefore they're really committed to it. It needs to be deeper, it needs to be thinking through the kind of thing. So and I'm a bit reluctant to say, oh, well, we have a development bargain on health, but on nothing else, and it makes it all a little bit strange to me as well. Question on, the difficult ones. Reparations. I'm sure others in the room will want to say something about it. My only point on that is that, you know, there is the moral case for this thing. Of course, it's extremely strong. But at the same time, it's a bit like, when is the right moment, which I find very hard. The same would apply, say, with tax havens and so on. I don't think, if I'm really honest, I would never have tried to give Kabila or Buhari more money. I would find that there may be a moral case, a principled case, but if you're ever going to do it, when is the right moment? And I find it a very hard one, because, you know, there are countries where that is really, could be a powerful thing. But if we get, you know, Kabila, father or son, loads of money, what do you think would have happened with it? Would it actually have developed the country? And then finally, Ethiopia, I think it's a little bit more subtle with the infrastructure finance. A lot is actually, in the end, was financed domestically. The Renaissance Dam was funded domestically and so on. And the Chinese debt is significant, but it's not the only international debt in the conversations. But it does remind me of a conversation that made me think, and I didn't know what to say to it. This was the time of the Sierra Leone, the end of Ebola, where, you know, organizations like DFID wanted to work on the kind of an Ebola dividend kind of thing for the population and doing all the things. And I remember talking to a Chinese counselor, Sierra Leone, and I was talking, what do you want to do? I said, no, we want to give them an airport. And indeed, anyone who knows a bit of that history, everything went pear-shaped on it, because the president wanted an airport and donors wanted to do social sectors. But the Chinese counselor said, and it made me think, he said, I don't understand why you always only want to do social sectors. And he had a point, that the airport was a bad idea, but there is something there. And so in Ethiopia, I think that's opportunistic. The way I knew the Ethiopian government, it was deeply opportunistic. There was no outsider who was going to pay for the infrastructure beyond China, for some of it at least, Turkish as well a bit. And then, you know, we were willing, because we couldn't be seen to do certain things, we were willing to do the other one. And I think I like the, you know, with all the shortcomings of what has happened, say, period 2005, 2018, or even now, I like always the sense of ownership of the Ethiopian government. You know, they make the outsider sweat a bit, and I think that's right. I do also remember that they would say, when a donor was to pitch a donor project, there was one, a very particular one, I remember, a land rights project, and DFID was pitching it to do it. And the government said, look, let's come back to it, because we may find it really important, and then we'd rather pay for it ourselves. And so I like that kind of attitude. And I think that's how they played the international community, for better or for worse.
They definitely have played international community for a long time. Hannah, the question of reparations was.
Yeah, I also just want to pick on the Ethiopia question a little bit as well, because I think Ethiopia is one of those, again, an example of a country that has basically has been a kind of development struggle, and has been, you know, we are going to keep our specific policies. You're trying to, and this is what Dr. Okabe was saying in his response was, look, the conditionality from the bank on the dam and so was just too much for us. We weren't okay with it, and as a result, they went to the partner who didn't have that conditionality, and that was China. So, but they were also able to say, well, actually, but there will be some areas where we think that our traditional donors, OECD donors, will be useful. And I think that is, can you identify it early on? I doubt it. But you can identify a country that is pushing for its sovereignty. And I think if that's what we are, if development is about reducing dependency and about increasing sovereignty, perhaps, then that's something that might be an identifier, and that's something not to be pushed against by FCDO or others. It's something to be welcomed, but it would be a massive shift from where countries are at the moment, from where donors are at the moment. I would also say that, and I wanted to come back also on Jamie's point, and it relates a little bit to the political settlement point. I think one of the biggest issues right now that we're facing in multilateralism generally is that while many countries have done their very best to try and kind of, especially recipient countries, borrowing countries, recipients, have done their best to try and kind of follow the international rules and norms and do these plans and that plan for poverty reduction, etc. What they haven't had back is the other side of the domestic policy reform on trade. Very little has changed. Very little has changed in terms of the shape of foreign direct investment, the kind of cheapness of foreign direct investment, for instance, the willingness of foreign direct investors to go in without massive extractive bargains themselves. So that's one of I think that's one of the challenges that actually recipients themselves now want to launch a struggle, want to kind of express that agency. And in a way, aid has almost been a kind of cover for some of that. Sadly, we have all these aid for trade schemes, but actually it would be better for the UK to be opening up to have vanilla and so on from Madagascar, whoever it goes to. But really, if you're thinking in a long-term sovereignty kind of perspective, then that's more useful. And the aid it's almost been a focus even from the elites in recipient countries on they've been kind of dealing with crumbs almost, rather than trying to end conditionality without opening up this big international space for massive flows of finance that they really need to actually deliver on the SDGs. And that's where segueing into reparations, because I think reparations does provide potentially, moral arguments, yes, but also it provides that potential space for that to happen. And for that large fiscal space to be created, the real billions to trillions, because that was the scale of the challenges that happened in the first place, and the atrocities that happened in the first place. So I don't know where it's going to go, but I think it will be a really interesting space to watch, and a really interesting evolution as I think development practitioners start to actually engage with it. And I think many development practitioners have not engaged with it, partly because many development practitioners just don't talk about colonialism or imperial history, whatever. All our development textbooks, Stefan, just don't engage with it enough, don't put it into theories. And so if we start doing that, maybe reparations can actually come into the discussion as something really real, and that can be actually shaped to be something really helpful.
Thanks, Hannah. Rakin and Jerry, before I come to you, I just want to squeeze in one additional question from Nilima Gurajani at ODI. Nilima is asking, gambling implies risk-taking, but we know donors are risk-averse. What kind of elite bargain in donor countries is needed to change this attitude to risk?
Donors are not risk-averse when they can see their interests clearly articulated.
Yes.
France is not risk-averse in France-Afrique.
No.
Where's it risk-averse? It's meddling all the time. So the assumption, again, this is the assumption that there's some benevolent algorithm called, the aid community, which is dealing with all these countries purely out of lack of self-interest. So I'll give you an example of what happens when the game shakes up. So now the UK is trying to do this free trade agreement with India. And what is India saying? We're not interested in talking about free trade, we're talking about relaxing your migration rules. And therefore I get a lot of questions on small boats and what are these people about? We don't understand their logic. They need people, and why are they not willing to discuss with me how we can send tens of thousands of people to NHS smoothly in exchange for buying, Shrewsbury biscuits or whatever. That makes sense now. I have no idea. Trifle. Or tourism.
Yeah.
So now this is a valid discourse, because what is then happening is that, and this pertains to your point,
Exactly.
that who said that free movement of goods is good, but free movement of people is not? Who made this rule? When did this rule come about, and why should I abide by it? Now, I could not say this 40 years ago, but now we can't say it. So I think this idea of mutual national self-interest, which is the only way you can deal with colonialism, imperialism, etc., has to sort of, you cannot have the benevolent algorithm aid giver dealing with a self-interested government in a donor country. I'll give you another example on Malawi. There's some history here, which I remember. I remember pleading when I was in the UN with Jeffrey Sachs. Please do not make the mistake India made and dump fertilizer on bloody Malawi. Please don't do this. I'm going to destroy agriculture. So Malawi could have done better on agriculture, possibly. Could it have without Jeffrey Sachs? Possibly. Has it with Jeffrey Sachs? Definitely not. Yes. Now, what happens there, forget colonialism, is everyone's forgotten. There's no question of reparations for Jeffrey's misguided policies in Malawi that have resulted in, at least in part, in substantial measure, I'd say, if not completely, in the difficulties that Malawi faces. So many of these things, are things that donors do, and there is not enough reflection on how to make them right. So without that sense of history, if one goes in and says Malawi is a bad bet, one would be making an error which the Malawians know. And then the next time they deal with you, they will take that into account that these guys are good. I'll give you another example. I don't like budget support. I was a great fan of it. And then something happened in Uganda. And I said, my God, this is a disaster. So the UK, I think it was the UK, suspended budget support because of LGBT policy in Uganda. But that was not the reason. Good or bad, Museveni's political policies were not a reason to withdraw or give budget support. That's not my point, for whatever reason. The trouble with budget support is if the donor country decides to stop it, my whole development program is gone. Whereas if I was doing 2 education, 1 health, whatever people like to do, 1 governance, 2 civil society, then I'd lose 2 education, 1 health, 1 governance, 1 civil society, right? I won't lose my whole development program. So again, here, power matters. And budget support is not being mediated between 2 countries with equal power. It is a powerful country providing budget support to a not powerful country. And the consequences of that bargain, unraveling, fall quite terribly on the recipient. So I don't like budget support.
Jamie.
I mean, I feel like I didn't really answer your question earlier, which is,
trying to push you.
is there ever any use of aid? And, in terms of a sectoral bargain, I think on health, there's pretty good data. And even in northern Nigeria, there are places where health gets, I have to check my map, but I think Kaduna's in the north. And it's not a small place. It's tens of millions of people. So, it gets results in lots of different locations, but it's not the whole development bargain. And then, aid that is adjacent to some of the policies that are the sort of the global public good, the things that create conducive environments, particularly around illicit capital flight and strengthening institutions that, promote good governance, may not be big ticket items, but they are often good uses, and they're often directly in response to the requests from civil society groups, which I think we should always bear in mind and work towards. I also would love to see us explore much more the things that re-inspire publics. You asked a question about how do we re-energize, should we say, the global movement for development of the right kind in the right way. And I do think there's something that we have to get back to that's quite basic about solidarity between citizens, irrespective of their countries, which sounds very idealistic, but actually there's various ways policy can enable and help that, and it can rebuild things between communities, and between things that aren't just at the national level. So that would seem to me like an promising area to explore that also will help strengthen, I think, global North type policy support, public support. Beyond that, it'd be completely wrong not to talk about the fact that we have in a few weeks' time a summit in Paris, where we've got some political leadership trying to cobble together a kind of a big financing offer through partially through reform of the multilateral development banks and other places. And in that, we should, put it like that, we should work really hard to make sure this isn't a disaster this summer in a couple of weeks, and that it is somewhat of a success and helps build momentum. China's coming to it at a senior level. India's engaging with it at a senior level. Lula is going to it. Not enough G7 countries are going to it currently, and that is a problem that, in particular in this country, it would be a total travesty if Prime Minister Sunak does not personally go. He changed his mind last minute and decided to go to Sharm el-Sheikh, and he should be persuaded to change his mind again here and go to this summit in France. And, over the next couple of years from that, particularly towards the Brazilian G20 and the South African G20, we should see much more strong global South led reform and change of the financial system. And I don't think it's any accident that one of the great leaders of our time, at least not in terms of the size of her country, but in terms of the size of her leadership, is Prime Minister Motley, who has led on reparations and is leading on climate justice, which is also making a very hard-headed case about reform of the financial system. And probably the greatest reparation would be to repair the financial system so it stops this kind of nonsense from continuing. And that's the job of development campaigners, I think, before us. Global public investment, which many of us sort of are engaged in, that network, I think we'll see a lot of interest and engagement on that concept. And it'd be interesting to see how that interplays with the idea of the development bargain. You know, so Stefan, I want to work for your basic hypothesis, but I do need to know when we've got one.
Or we can carry on discussing that next door with a few drinks and nibbles, because we are at time, and I think this is a good note to end on, because I do think that all of us have been sort of working on development issues for a long time. We're all at a juncture, and I think right now it really is about, you know, re-engaging and re-energizing the public, first of all. Move away from, you know, the delivery that we've been doing for the past 20, 30 years. It's not the space for northern organizations or donors anymore, but it is about pushing our governments, you know, it's really reigniting the global solidarity movement that you were talking about, so that we can have a more equitable bargain between, you know, donors and recipient countries, a more equitable bargain that supports what Mia Mottley and many others are doing, you know, to push for the change that is long overdue. We will continue this conversation at ODI. I am sure the recording of this conversation will be online in the next couple of days. I'm sorry for the online audience that can't join us next door for drinks and nibbles, but we can carry on the conversation there. But please join me to thank Jamie, Stefan, Raken, and Hannah. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are we going to get it measured?